Joining me now, our resident lawyer around here, Will Chamberlain. He is the senior counsel of Unsilenced Majority and co-publisher of Human Events. Will, I think we should bring up again this eviction moratorium because I'm just having a hard time wrapping my mind around the fact the President of the United States stood up to a podium and said, yeah, I know it's illegal, but we'll probably get away with it until the courts turn it around.
Yeah, I mean, I'm torn between two impulses. One is the sort of horror at the fact that our president would just breach his oath of office so blatantly. Like you took an oath to say you're going to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, and now you're on stage saying, well, it's not really constitutional, but I'm going to do it anyway. That seems impeachable in sort of the classic definition of the term, even if we don't have the power to do it. But the second impulse I have is, well, okay, fine, let's get creative here. I mean, if this is now the extent of the CDC's power, I don't see why they can't just seize every Ivy League university campus and mainstream media outlet and turn them into COVID field hospitals because, it's an emergency and we need some space to deal with people who are ill. So what is the limitation on this power? I don't see it. And so I'm not willing to unilaterally disarm it. If this is the new standard where we're just going to do unlawful things and be okay with it, well, what happens when we take power? Maybe we should start doing some unlawful things to hurt the left too.
Why don't we? Well, I honestly, it would have been about 5 minutes ago, I'd have heard you say that and say that's nuts. But clearly, Will, these people are not backing off. They're not slowing down. They're not getting to a point where they say, whoa, we've taken this too far. They're hammering the gas pedal. What choice do we have at this point in time?
Right. And remember all the people whining about what terrible precedents President Trump was setting by declaring a national emergency over the border wall. I mean, I remember people saying, well, if we do that, Democrats will feel the ability to do something similar. It's like, no. Democrats just do unprecedented things all the time. That's been the case. That was the case under Obama. It's clearly the case now. I mean, you can say what you want about President Trump, but I think even the most avid Trump hater couldn't point to an example of him knowingly violating his oath of office, knowingly doing something unlawful. And this is it's just bizarre that everybody's treating it like another day at the office.
Will, I don't know that I've ever feared the answer to a question more than the one I'm about to ask, but the Supreme Court is going to shoot this down, right?
The question is, are they going to get it in time, and is there going to be someone withstanding so that at the time that they need it? So the problem is the law or the order was put in place with a severe deterrent if you break it, which is like $100,000 fine and a year in prison or something, which I don't think anybody's willing to risk just to evict someone. Which means that you're sort of relying on a theory of standing that says, well, as long as this law is on the books, I can't evict my tenant. But what happens when the moratorium expires? Then the dispute is moot. So I think that basically the administration's being really cynical by making the penalty so severe for violating the order. They're ensuring that no one really does violate it, and then make sure that any future court dispute will be moot because by the time it works its way up to the Supreme Court, the moratorium will be over.
Okay, a couple things on that because there were a bunch of fancy lawyer words in there I didn't quite understand.
Okay. So moot, is that a key
one? Can people sue? I mean, that sounds like something as a landlord you should be able to sue over, right? You don't just get to slap me in the face with an unlawful thing and then 60 days later say, well, I guess I was wrong when I've lost 60 days of income.
Sure. So you can go into sue into court and you'd probably get an injunction at the lower court level, right? You go in front of your local district judge, say, Your Honor, this law is clearly unconstitutional. I should be able to evict my tenant who's not paying me. The CDC doesn't have the right to tell me I can't. Clearly basic landlord-tenant law here. Also basic principles of separation of powers between the states and the federal government. I mean, there's a lot of problems with what the Biden administration is doing. Okay, so you do that. You go into court, you win. Well, then the CDC appeals. Okay, and that takes a little time to get to the appellate court to have them resolve it and get the injunction, what's called affirmed, to say that, yes, what the CDC is doing is wrong. And then the CDC will appeal again to the Supreme Court. And it's like each of those things takes time. And this is a temporary moratorium extension. And the problem is there's a concept in law called mootness, which is the idea that if you're no longer being injured, right, then you no longer have a case and the courts don't have the right to do anything about it. You have to be currently injured is kind of the idea. And so if by the time it reaches the Supreme Court, the moratorium has expired, it's over, and you can go ahead and evict someone, then the court will say, well, there's no dispute here, so we don't have to resolve it. That's what I'm worried about. I think the Democrats are designing this to try and evade review as long as possible, and then just end the moratorium by the time they might get an unfriendly ruling.
Okay, I just asked the scariest question. Now I'm going to ask the most pathetic one because it's going to make me sound like a traditional Republican. How can any of this be legal? Like, how can this be done? Do we have law? How is any of this legal?
It's like we have law, but it's sort of reliant on people following it. I mean, the Supreme Court actually ruled on the constitutionality of the moratorium in June, I think, or in early July. And they said, look, this isn't constitutionally sound. We're not going to reverse it because it's going to expire in 3 weeks, but it's not constitutionally sound. And I think the problem here is they sort of assumed that the Biden administration would get the hint and not just continue to extend the moratorium, which the Supreme Court said is unlawful. And instead, the Biden administration is just kind of ignoring that and going ahead and doing it knowing it's unlawful, knowing the Supreme Court's going to strike them down, because they just know that it takes time for the legal process to work on these things, so they get what they want anyway. And that's why I'm thinking, like, how can we be creative? I mean, if this is the new standard for executive branch behavior, then, let's just do a bunch of unlawful stuff. And, until the court deals with it, we can just keep doing unlawful stuff and, essentially get inside the court's OTA loop and effectively just run the country the way we want.
Let's switch gears here for one more question about one that's on our side. We have good governors like Ron DeSantis, pointing to employers in his state saying, no, you cannot mandate a vaccine for your employees. That's not allowed. I love it. Is that going to hold up in the courts?
I think so. Absolutely. That's a case where, states have what's called the police power, right? A lot of people forget about this, and for the same reason that states had the power to impose all these things like mask mandates, they also have the power to impose a ban on vaccine passports, right? They have the ability to regulate commerce or to make rules and regulations in their state about private business behavior. That's kind of the core of the 10th Amendment, right? The powers that the federal government doesn't have belong to the states. So I don't see a reason they'd have to point to some federal essentially some individual right that's being violated here and argue that there's maybe a speech right or a freedom of association right for a business to say that they have the right to exclude people who aren't vaccinated. But I don't think that's going to fly. I don't think freedom of association isn't that strong generally. Think about all the civil rights laws that sort of, supposedly would have violated free association, but everybody thinks are kosher.
Hey, thanks so much for watching The First on YouTube. If you liked what you saw, go ahead and like and subscribe. You heard me. Like it, subscribe. You'll get a lot more of it and a lot more of me.